will. And it's interesting because he's claiming that atheists require some kind of certainty, and then he's going on to assert that until science demonstrates that it has all the answers, in other words, until science demonstrates this certainty that he claims he doesn't need, he's just not going to put any of his faith in it. So I think that he's been quite inconsistent with his arguments here and betraying a complete misunderstanding of what these terms actually mean.
Yeah, and there's a lot of this. I think I'm going to have to kind of rehash and rework the lecture that I did on belief, which is available online to watch, because at the time things have changed in the dialogues that I have since I gave that lecture, and where I was focused on knowledge and certainty, and knowledge being a subset of belief, and the labels for agnostic and atheist being, potential subsets of each other when you're talking about theism. There is this idea, not only, as you point out, does he portray atheism as an absolute position, an absolute certainty, and as I've said many times on this show, outside of a handful of things, I reject that absolute certainty could be attained, or that it's particularly useful or relevant. Because by and large, when we talk about, I know something, you could sit there and nitpick and say, well, are you absolutely certain? And then they would say, no, I'm not absolutely certain. But what we really mean is we're as certain as we possibly could be. It would be worldview altering to find out that I'm wrong. And so if you're going to say that knowledge equals absolute certainty, then sure, you're correct on all counts. But the practical usage of knowledge does not convey anything having to do with absolute certainty. If anything, it's an acknowledgement that we're not absolutely certain, that we know, or I shouldn't use the word in describing it, that we believe something to such a high degree of certainty that we're willing to consider it knowledge, that it has been tested and stood the test to the best that we can, that it represents the best possible assessment of information that we can make, that it is the most reasonable, evidence-based supported position we currently have. And we acknowledge that, of course, we could be wrong. Now, on that level, I have said in that lecture that it may be fair to call me a Gnostic theist, that as long as you don't make atheist, I did it again, a Gnostic atheist, in that as long as you don't make a requirement that one be absolutely certain. There's a difference between I do not believe a God exists and I believe no gods exist. Those are two different propositions that tend to get equated and muddled up in this when you're talking about an atheist is somebody who says there is no God, absolutely. As long as you don't make a requirement of absolute certainty, and I don't, and by the way, I get to define myself, sorry, I can say I not only do not believe gods exist, I believe gods don't exist. And I believe this to almost a sufficient degree of certainty to qualify as knowledge when we're using it as a colloquialism.
Yes.
But I'm perfectly willing to be wrong, and I don't need to put myself in a position where I need to defend that or to assert that as a position, because there's a God exists. Have you met your burden for proof for that? And as long as that never happens, then I'm still fine and well supported in the I don't believe your claim. And I don't believe it because, as you pointed out, you haven't presented evidence for it. Oh. This knowledge and certainty thing, it gets to be a nightmare. And actually there's at least one caller waiting who addresses that.
Yes.
So I don't know if you want to hit the next part or take calls related to it or not.
Well, there's the next portion here kind of goes to what you're saying about knowledge and certainty. He makes the statement that he doesn't believe that there's evidence or falsifiable certitude that science can prove or disprove everything. And to that I would respond, who says it has to? Who has ever claimed that science can prove or disprove everything? This is another example of a straw man that he's building here so he can just knock it down. And at this point in the article, I was starting to wonder, is his beef with science or atheism? Because he seems to be conflating the two.
Not only that, there's confusion in like the level at which we're discussing this.
Yeah.
For example, he wants to go for an extremely rigid take on knowledge, that it's absolute
Right.
certainty in order to make his point. And then he uses the loosest possible version for proof. Because if you want to go the kind of stringent down the line, this is what words mean and how they apply to disciplines, prove is not something that is relevant to science, mathematical proofs. And there you actually are dealing with absolute certainty. In science, what you come up with are models that describe the world and models that have withstood the tests and are consistently reliable. That becomes the scientific knowledge base, and it has nothing to do with absolute certainty. So on the one hand, he's using a rigid absolute certain, and then he turns around and uses a non-rigid, oh, well, science can't prove everything. Hey, science doesn't prove anything. If you're going to use absolute certainty, let's stick with it consistent.
Yes. And then he, let's see, before we get to calls here, just one more thing here. He talks about agnosticism doesn't fear uncertainty. It doesn't cling like a child in the dark to the dogmas of Orthodox religion or atheism. And again, he doesn't understand that atheism is not, there's no dogma. There's no fixed set of beliefs that you have to have. So he completely builds a straw man of atheism so he can knock it down and claim superiority. And I think that's the whole point of this, is that he doesn't want to take a position one way or the other, admit what he believes or doesn't believe. He's misunderstood his terms. And now he's written an article that outlines the way he's allowed himself to feel superior to both theists and atheists.
Yeah.
So
I like the example that we talked about earlier, in which, and we can actually play this out, because part of this has to do with asking the right questions. And if you don't know to ask the right questions, you are not going to get the right answers, and you're definitely going to put yourself in a position where you can get stuff really wrong. So when he begins with, at least we know what we don't know, and then demonstrates that he doesn't actually know what he doesn't know,
right.
And the way he represents agnosticism. So you could ask me if I believe. Yeah. Do I believe a God exists? If I answer, or
if you say
if I say I don't know, I haven't answered your question.
Right.
Because she didn't ask me whether or not I knew a God exists or knew a God didn't exist. She asked what I believed about the proposition a God exists. And in that case, there's only two options. You either do believe it or you don't. And it doesn't matter if in your not believing that proposition how certain you are or what you know to be true or anything else. One question's about belief, and then the other question, the knowledge question, is about the degree to which you believe it, essentially.
Yeah.
Approaching and possibly never reaching absolute certainty. But.
Right. Yeah, and we actually got an email from a guy one time who wanted to sort of put atheism on a scale. And he says, well, maybe, you could quantify it in terms of, do you believe 30% or 50% or 70%? And, that determines, I guess the strength of your atheist beliefs. And it's like I explained to him, it's not, to say that you 50% believe something is nonsense. Belief is binary. You either believe or you don't. Those are your only two choices.
Not only that, but he's framed it wrong too.
Yeah.
Because what he's really asking is, how certain are you of the proposition no gods exist? Which is entirely irrelevant, because what you should be asking is, based on the proposition some God exists, do you accept that? And if so, to what degree? Because if you don't accept that, it doesn't matter to what degree you don't accept it anymore.
Yeah.
That's where the burden of proof lies.
Yeah.
In this, I find it particularly funny because he does this whole layout of agnosticism is, it's the intellectual agnostic snobbery that I absolutely despise anyway. And then he takes Dawkins to task for being stringent and rigid and portraying his absolute certainty about God's existing.
Right.
And Dawkins himself has flatly said, even created a scale. And instead of going 1 to 10, I think he went 1 to 7 or something. And it's like, I'm about a 6 something, on this scale.
Yeah.
So he's flat, and it was in the God delusion. It's, I'm not stating with absolute certainty that no gods exist. So why is it that these people keep trying to portray it that way? What is it that they're really saying if instead of actually reading what people write and paying attention to what people do, we talked about it earlier. Look at the bus campaign in the UK. What did it say? There's probably no God, so stop worrying and get on with your life. Is that some stringent, absolute, certain, dogmatic belief? Nah, there's
No.
probably no God. And the various campaigns in the United States that have been up on billboards, don't believe in God, you're not alone. This has nothing at all about certainty or dogma or anything else. It's a complete straw man representation of this. And the thing is, when you get to this position, when you get to the point where you're writing, I would expect people to have done their homework and made an attempt to understand the issues. And so either the person is inept in their research or their ability to communicate, or they are intentionally being deceptive in order to promote an agenda.
Yeah.
Or they're just stupid. Could be the case. They could have researched really well and just not quite come to grips with it. But.
Yeah, and he does, I mean, he quotes Huxley in here, so he's done some work on this. I think he's just not given this enough thought, or maybe he doesn't care.
It seems one-sided research, because how could you say Richard Dawkins is asserting a position of absolute certainty when I mean, it's right there. I'm about a 6 on a 1 to 7.
But even in his article, he invokes this kind of emotional argument for it, and he talks about why has agnosticism fallen out of favor, and he goes on to say that new atheism offers the glamour of fraudulent rebelliousness.
Ooh.
So, yeah, we're just being rebellious. And he goes on to say that the willingness to say I don't know is less attention-getting, and yet that's what we say all the time when people call and ask us, hey, how did the universe start? Well, we don't know.
Don't know. Got some good scientific models that aren't exactly proof, but make testable predictions, seem to be borne out by evidence, so we're going to accept this tentatively, like we do every other explanation, as the best current. I mean, how hard is this?
Yeah.
I have yet to meet anybody of this particular breed of intellectual agnostics. They are the least willing, in my experience, to actually acknowledge that they don't know, in an intellectually honest sense. They're happy to scream, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, and pretend like not having an absolute answer means we can't have any possible idea about, I don't know why my bank account is $10 lower than I thought it was. You may be right. You may not know. You may not even have a good idea. But doesn't mean that we can't look at options and explanations. And if somebody A is explaining that leprechauns snuck into the bank at night and plucked credits out of your account using telepathy, and somebody else is saying you ate dinner somewhere and forgot about it, you don't pretend like we can't look at those two and come to a determination about which one is more likely to be correct.
Yeah.
So when we say that we have no idea, or well, actually, we don't know for certain, or even perhaps to an extremely high degree of certainty, how the universe came to be, or an explanation for why the universe is the way it is, don't pretend like we can't say there's probably some naturalistic explanation for this, and we've got some math that seems to be working, and compare that to there's a magical individual who exists outside of space and time who willed it into existence, and that's all we know about that individual, and not be able to determine which one of these is more likely. I mean, it's asinine.
Yeah.
And when I say I don't believe your fairies, pixies, gods, devils, demons, nonsense, that doesn't mean I'm saying you are absolutely wrong and I'm sure of it, or that you are a despicable liar and I'm certain of it, or anything like that. I'm saying you haven't met your burden of proof. And not only that, when we look at the situation in a broad spectrum, you've got a huge burden of proof to establish, because you're positing something that violates everything we know, to the extent that we know, about the universe.
And then when you compare that to the fMRI results, where believers, when asked, well, what does this magical being that exists outside of time and space want from you and everybody else, when you put them in an fMRI and ask them this question, the brain area that lights up is the same area that lights up when they think about what they want from people. Yeah. So it's just them making it up, or at least they think that they're channeling God or whatever, when in fact it's just what they think.
Yeah. In this case, you've got people who are so enamored with the idea of being open to possibilities that they misrepresent truly intellectually honest positions that properly consider where the burden of proof lies as some kind of strident, dogmatic,